This video is sponsored by World Anvil. If you want your heroes to be in jeopardy, or to be challenged to resolve the plot single-handedly, they kind of can't have an infrastructure to support them. They can have allies, but they can't have so much help that you feel like it's inevitable that they're going to solve the problem. Because the NPCs can't solve the problem for your heroes, because that's unsatisfying. Now, you might think of some exceptions to this rule, but I honestly think this is one of the most important rules of dramatic storytelling. And if you're going to break it in your stories or your games, fair enough, but you should at least understand why I think this is so important. I want to start by referencing a Brennan Lee Mulligan quote. He's discussing railroading in RPGs, which is different than what we're talking about today, but I still think the way he describes the mindset of players and player characters is very helpful for this discussion.
When I'm a player, I want to be living in a story, immersed into a character that is not, to their knowledge, living in a story. Like Evan Kelp says in Misfits and Magic, I'm not a character, right? I don't want to play a character that's thinking about their fucking narrative arc. I want to play a character that wants to save the world as quickly and efficiently as possible, right? But I, the player, want the arc. So me and my character exist at odds because I want the deep immersion. I want the fucking Mount Doom, Frodo's Quest, all that shit. But I want to play a character that doesn't want that. I want to play a character that gets the ring as quickly and safely as possible to Mount Doom because that's the immersion I'm looking for. So what does that mean if I want to provide that experience to a player? Players are like water. They are going down the hill as fast as they can, seeking the path of least resistance. That's the character is like water. But the player wants anything other than a straight line. So my job as rails is irrigating a path down that lets the water always have taken the fastest route towards its goal, but at the end of it, the shape is the most convoluted and pleasing, right? That like, you achieved the shape of a story while you were trying your hardest to go in a straight line.
In a way, this topic is all about just resolving one of those bends. Usually it's the first bend, or it's very early in the story. It's giving the heroes a reason they have to get involved, but why they can't call anybody else to help. Because the player characters probably want to call the authorities and have somebody else solve the problem, even though the players also want to be heroes. Sometimes the players can come up with their own explanation for why they wouldn't try to recruit the authorities, but depending on the circumstances, their solutions might feel contrived. Likewise, there are some situations where it's just completely irrational that they wouldn't try to appeal to a higher authority. For example, maybe you've designed a world where powerful wizards are a trusted part of the government. So, if you go and talk to the authorities, not only would they have the legal jurisdiction to intervene where the heroes don't, but they might literally have the power to do so because they know magic. So sometimes, as the game master, it's your job to clear the board and make it so that there are no authorities to call. Maybe you literally destroy the support system, or corrupt it, or turn it against the heroes, or just have them occupied by another, apparently more important task. We can see this idea represented perfectly in the first Die Hard movie. When he's trapped in a skyscraper with a bunch of terrorists, even after he watches them murder someone, John McClane tries desperately to call the authorities. He pulls the fire alarm, but the bad guys deactivate it. He calls the cops, but they don't believe him. That one does feel contrived. The movie does not do a terrific job of selling us on that one, which is probably why the cops do eventually send one patrolman to check out the situation. But the bad guys are practiced liars and are able to deflect suspicion. John McClane is finally able to get that officer's attention by, killing a terrorist and throwing his body down for the cop to notice. In other words, the only thing that gets him any support is when he finally takes action and kills a bad guy, and he's rewarded with an ally. It's excellent storytelling. The following Die Hard films struggle with this. Die Hard 2 just doesn't resolve it. He's working with the cops for the entire movie, but he's just smarter than them, and it feels implausible that he'd have as much latitude as he does. And I think this is something that we find ourselves doing in a lot of our tabletop games. We want to show that the problem is serious, so of course the local authorities would want to help. But we also want the main characters to feel like heroes, so everybody just sort of listens to them and gives them the space to do whatever they need to do. And it feels totally artificial, especially at lower levels. Die Hard 3 also has a team of supportive cops, but the bad guy explicitly says, nope, they cannot help the heroes. It's not a perfect solution, but at least it's something. And then in the back half of the movie, the cops are running around trying to deal with large-scale problems, like the threat of a bomb in a school, leaving our heroes to go on the more action-packed adventure of trying to find and defeat the villain. That's also more or less the fourth film's approach to its police. They're just overwhelmed with the chaos caused by Timothy Oliphant's character. And I didn't see the fifth Die Hard movie. It looked pretty bad. For a bunch more examples, let's take a look at the Mission Impossible franchise. In just about every installment, there's some plot reason why the good guys can never call the cavalry to come swoop in and save the day. At the time of recording, I haven't seen the 7th film yet. It's been a pretty busy summer so far, but in most of the first 6 films, we can see a very clear pattern around how the agency Ethan Hunt works for, the Impossible Missions Force, is either neutered, compromised, or hostile toward our hero. In the first film, Ethan Hunt is framed for killing his team and disavowed by the IMF. So in order to figure out who really killed his teammates, he has to go rogue. His only help is one remaining surviving team member who the IMF still thinks is dead. And to round out his team, he has to go find 2 other disavowed agents. And the whole film is about whether or not he can trust anybody. It's a very cerebral movie that actually totally holds up. That movie's really good. Throughout the third film, Hunt has to work with fewer and fewer resources. First mission, his team has the full support of the IMF. Second mission, it's an unsanctioned operation, but they've still got all the resources they would, with fancy cars and costumes and masks. Then he gets disavowed and branded a traitor, and while his friends and his boss still agree to help him, the team is still fully off the books. In the fourth film, the entire IMF is disavowed and dissolved. Our team has one train car full of equipment, and as we see throughout the film, even their fancy gadgets keep breaking down. The wall-climbing gloves short out, the mask-making machine jams, their camera contact lens is too noticeable. Even the one thing it seems like they still had, their cool tech, is unreliable. In the fifth film, the government is reviewing whether or not the IMF should even exist, so the entire IMF is decommissioned. Again, or still? I'm not really sure, and it barely matters, because the point is, no more agency. In the sixth film, they botch a mission at the beginning, and while they're not technically disavowed, they do get stuck with a babysitter from the CIA watching their every move, and every additional slip-up just runs the risk of getting them deeper and deeper into political hot water. And while I'm sure we could dive into the implications of the fact that these films frame government oversight as a bad thing that keeps the heroes from having the resources they need to do their jobs, I don't want to get into that because it's also a narrative necessity to make sure the IMF is off the board for the bulk of each movie. While it's completely and clearly contrived that Ethan Hunt and or his team keeps getting disavowed over and over again whenever it's time for a new movie to happen, it's also basically required to make sure these plots are as thrilling as possible. Because the story is a lot less tense and a lot less satisfying if Ethan Hunt can just call the IMF and order a drone strike or an army to come mop up the bad guys. Actually, you know what's funny? I have no idea if either of those things are things the IMF can even do because we've never seen them at their full capacity, because seeing a strong, thriving IMF that can swoop in and rescue the hero is completely counter to the dramatic goals of these films. We don't want to see a super powerful government agency with no oversight solve all the problems in these movies. I mean, I don't want to see that for a whole bunch of reasons, but chief among them is that it wouldn't make for very compelling drama. But ironically, you can't just get rid of the agency either. The premise of these films demands that the IMF exists because we need somebody to make these cool recordings that self-destruct, and we want the good guys to be able to make those masks. But the IMF also can't help solve the problems that arise in these movies, because we want to instead see our heroes struggle to overcome overwhelming odds. So having an all-powerful government agency at their back is, again, not ideal for those sorts of stories. Thus, the IMF is in a constant loop of existing at the beginning of every movie, and then either disavowing Ethan, or more recently, being heavily scrutinized by other agencies and having their hands tied up in red tape, so the heroes can strike out on their own. And then usually the agency returns to some form of the status quo by the end of the movie. Again, I haven't seen the 7th movie yet, so I don't know whether or not they handle the IMF situation the same way. Maybe it doesn't get back to a status quo by the end of the movie. I mean, it is part 1 of 2, but I also truly doubt that we'll ever see a full-strength IMF supporting Ethan Hunt throughout these films without being hamstrung by some sort of oversight or misunderstanding. Again, maybe this is hilariously wrong. I haven't seen the new movie, but don't spoil it in the comments. I still really want to see it. We can also see the same dramatic issue in action in the MCU. Now, I really do like the MCU. I'd consider myself a fan of most of those movies. But we can also see that this is a franchise that has really struggled to get this right. In Phase 1, S.H.I.E.L.D. swoops in to help solve some problems in Iron Man 2, and while I do think that film is underrated, the presence of S.H.I.E.L.D. does undercut the narrative tension more than a little bit. But after that film, there's usually a reason for S.H.I.E.L.D. to not solve all the problems that come up in each film. In Thor, they're more of an obstacle, and in Captain America 1, we see their earliest days as they struggle to get the budget and latitude they need to fight their enemies. Then the Avengers happens, and again, S.H.I.E.L.D. is helpful but also kind of an adversary. But after that film, we have a new, far more pressing issue that comes up in every movie. Why don't our heroes just call the other Avengers for help? Iron Man 3 and Thor 2 don't include the help of any other Avengers or S.H.I.E.L.D. agents, much to the chagrin of the audience. And then we get Captain America 2, where Cap is working with another Avenger, Black Widow, but they still don't call any of their other non-S.H.I.E.L.D. allies. Actually, they don't even call Hawkeye, who is a S.H.I.E.L.D. ally. That being said, This film finally does solve the SHIELD problem by revealing that the entire agency is compromised and then dismantling it. But again, they don't call Iron Man or the Hulk or Hawkeye. Now, some of these examples can be more easily excused than others. I don't think Tony Stark could get to London fast enough for the events of Thor 2, but he could probably get to DC by the finale of Winter Soldier. And in Iron Man 3, the president is kidnapped by terrorists. It's kind of wild that nobody even mentions calling in Captain America or Nick Fury. Avengers 2 sees the team perform some questionable behavior in the public eye, so in Ant-Man, when someone finally asks, hey, why don't we call the Avengers? Well, there's an answer. Hank Pym doesn't trust Tony Stark, and also the Avengers keep doing war crimes. And yet we do still see an Avenger make a cameo. And again, Scott references how he fought an Avenger and didn't die. Yet another line in Ant-Man that mentions how casually the MCU heroes kill people, which is something I do not like and I thought might stop after Ant-Man called it out, but then it super didn't stop. But that's a topic for another day. Phase 3 navigates this problem better by tearing the Avengers apart in Captain America 3, so of course nobody's going to call in for them for help. But also, in the other Phase 3 films, we get other Avengers cross-connections. Iron Man is a major character in Spider-Man Homecoming, which actually really solves this problem in a smart way. Spider-Man does try to call in Iron Man and or the Avengers for help, but he keeps getting ghosted because nobody takes him seriously. And the one time they do, when Iron Man does actually show up to help, he just winds up seeing how Spider-Man bungled the situation, which hurts Spider-Man's credibility. Meanwhile, Thor gets tossed all the way across the galaxy, so it would make sense if he had no allies, and yet he still gets to team up with the Hulk, because Marvel was starting to realize that having other heroes show up in superhero solo sequels helps solve this problem, and also capitalizes on the shared universe concept that set them apart from other franchises. Black Panther is a solo endeavor because that movie is explicitly all about whether or not Wakanda should continue to be an isolationist nation. And Ant-Man and the Wasp features no other heroes because it's a screwball comedy about trying to do superhero shenanigans and still making it back home in time before the FBI shows up and barely getting away with it. So we as an audience are forgiving of both of those examples. Even in the next two big Avengers movies, we can see this concept in action. Even though Infinity War was a crossover sensation that brought basically every hero together to a truly unprecedented level, the heroes are still scattered due to the events of Civil War. And because of that, because they don't face Thanos all together, they lose. By the time we reach the finale of Endgame, we've earned the chance to finally see the MCU united, just for one big fight. So of course they save the day. Well, still by the skin of their teeth, but they save the day because they all work together. But this would ordinarily be bad dramatic storytelling. You don't want your heroes to be an unstoppable force. But in this case, it's the fulfillment of 11 years of setup all paying off. So we get to finally enjoy it. And besides, Avengers Endgame is still ridiculously good at keeping the focus of the finale on completing the character arcs of their core characters, but again, maybe we'll talk about that some other day. And this is where the MCU ran into a problem. Because narratively, you need to keep explaining why you can't just call the Avengers, which is getting harder and harder to accept, especially after we saw Endgame, and we saw what happened when everyone teamed up. They won. And while I didn't dislike Phase 4 as much as a lot of people seem to, I do think it's really tough to tell new stories where the premise is big superhero shenanigans are happening without explaining why the Avengers or anybody else are not getting involved. Also, Marvel didn't do themselves any favors by basically turning S.W.O.R.D. into the new version of S.H.I.E.L.D. We're gonna have the same issue we had at the beginning of the MCU, where it's getting kind of weird that nobody is calling anybody else for help. Because when you're telling a dramatic story, you don't want the good guys to be able to call for help. But if you don't bake that dilemma into the plot, then it always just feels contrived. And this is where we talk about the Purge franchise. Listen, I'm not a horror guy, it's just not my thing, but even I knew that the horror genre had been grappling with this issue for a long time. Slasher films already had to have bad guys cut phone lines, or the writers had to drop their heroes in a remote cabin far from any support to just explain why these teenagers could get brutally murdered for an hour and a half without the cops trying to help at all. And then we created cell phones, and it got even worse. Because now, for the past 2 decades, every horror movie trailer includes a line about being somewhere that has no cell service, or how everybody's phones are low on battery or something. We saw this come up in action movies too, but horror movies really needed this contrivance, otherwise the plots just couldn't happen. And then, along came The Purge. Now, I've never seen The Purge, no idea if it's a good movie, it's probably not. But regardless, the premise itself is perfect, because they figured out what so many other horror movies failed to resolve. You don't actually have to get rid of the cell phones. You just need an excuse for why nobody can come and help you. So that's the entire premise of The Purge. For 12 hours, crime is legal and there are no emergency services. Everybody rational just locks themselves in their homes, and so by default, you have to treat anybody you see on the street as an enemy. It's such a perfect solution to the cell phone problem. You don't need to deplete the batteries or remove cell coverage. The heroes can call anybody they want. But nobody's coming. You're on your own. Get Out does the same thing, but without having to completely create a new status quo or do any world building at all. They just make the main character a black man in America. So yeah, he also can't call the cops, but not because murder is legal for everyone for 24 hours. It's not a world building thing. It's just a commentary on the fact that police can arrest or kill black people for no reason and get away with it. But that's not necessarily the right solution for every story. That is a very specific solution that's derived from the social commentary inherent to that sort of story. Speaking of world building, sometimes this is a world building problem. Sometimes the issue is that you've created a setting where it is absolutely impossible that your heroes would not go to the government or the Council of Powerful Wizards because they would absolutely have the power to solve this problem. And speaking of wizard governments, let's talk about Harry Potter. By the time we reach the end of the 4th book, the status quo has been disrupted. Voldemort is back, a Hogwarts student is dead, Harry's childhood, which was full of high-stakes adventure stories that he still overcame through the power of friendship, well, that childhood is officially over. And so going into book 5, it's only natural to assume that the wizard government would have the power to solve this problem, or at least they'd be interested in trying. But then we find out just how bureaucratic the Ministry of Magic can be. In the past, they've been inept and unhelpful. But now, the Ministry is portrayed as willfully obtuse, or, in the case of Dolores Umbridge, actively sinister. But even setting aside the fact that she's, the worst human being on the planet and honestly one of the most hateable characters in the entirety of Western canon, the Ministry itself doesn't want to hear about a threat as significant as Voldemort, so they deny. The moment in the movie when Minister Fudge sees Voldemort and is shocked that he's back despite the fact that people have been telling him that Voldemort is back for the better part of an entire year is not only a banger of a joke, but it's also a terrific commentary on authorities that get so caught up in their own objectives that they miss the larger threats looming around them until they truly cannot be denied anymore. Of course, ironically, in the real world, politicians have learned over the last decade that they actually can deny objective truths that are right in front of their eyes, but that's not really the point. The ultimate point is this. Heroes want to have factions they can turn to for support, but factions have their own objectives, and internal politics and external politics can transform a normally useful faction into an obstacle or even an adversary. And while the Ministry of Magic was never depicted as all that helpful in the earlier installments, in this case, Harry Potter understands something that Captain America the Winter Soldier didn't. In Winter Soldier, S.H.I.E.L.D. is untrustworthy not because it's a law enforcement organization and a tool of the American government and is thus subject to the same flaws in politics and corruption as any other government agency. Sorry to say this, Nick Fury is not your friend. No, it's untrustworthy because it's been literally infiltrated by secret Nazis. Still a good movie, don't get me wrong, but it does sort of punt the core question of whether an individual has better judgment than a government body, so we can watch Steve Rogers beat up Nazis again. Which, once again, I'm fine with watching Steve Rogers kill Nazis. That's okay by me. But the 5th Harry Potter book and movie both display how the people in charge can, just choose to ignore huge threats that they don't want to deal with, just because they believe it would be politically inconvenient to do so. And so a group that would absolutely be helpful for solving the plot is turned into an antagonist because what they want is just contrary to what the main characters want. This is also the one time the Harry Potter franchise actually understood politics. Of course, like I said, this is really only an issue when you've built a world where there is some sort of higher authority who could solve all of your player characters' problems. But that's extremely tempting when world building. It's really hard to be thoughtful and nuanced about world building because, where do you even start? Well, obviously you start with today's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is a fantastic online toolkit that offers a ton of guidance through their useful templates. You're not starting totally from scratch because these templates actually encourage you to ask questions about your world that you might never have thought of. And then, once you've got your answers, World Anvil gives you the tools you need to take these answers and turn them into beautiful and dynamic articles so you can actually more easily read them and reference them later. And if you're a novelist, World Anvil has an area where you can actually write your manuscript right there through the website, which is incredibly convenient if you need to reference your setting information as you're writing. And if you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK, you can save 40% off of any annual membership. Once again, that is worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thank you so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. Now, in my experience, this is the kind of dilemma that becomes a bigger issue the bigger the threat is and the more high profile the heroes are. When you're dealing with huge threats, like bad guys who are trying to conquer the world or end civilization as we know it, then it's really hard for the players to accept the idea that everyone in the world wouldn't drop everything they're doing to help solve the problem. This isn't just main character syndrome, where the players say, why can't we just have everything we want? This is when the heroes are looking at a profound existential threat to life as we know it, and they're beating their hands bloody, pounding on the doors of the halls of power, trying to get someone to listen, and you hear them say things like, we're trying to save the world, why isn't anybody else helping? And the truth is, if you've got a big threat out there, you need a good reason why nobody is going to help the heroes in any meaningful way, by sending armies or wizards or armies of wizards. Likewise, if your heroes are somewhat notable, like they're members of the Tal'Dorei Council and or they've got the ear of the king, and they've built up a reputation for themselves as not just a couple of nobodies, but actually very famous heroes, then you can't just have the local authorities shrug and dismiss them without a really good reason. Like, if Superman showed up and told the cops about something going on, and the cops said, "Okay, buddy, whatever, yeah, we'll definitely look into that," then that would be pretty unbelievable. So in those occasions, you can establish that there's a support system in place and that they are potentially willing to help, but something is standing in the way. Maybe the people who could help are tied up dealing with other threats, or they're tangled up in jurisdictional red tape and can't help, or there's someone in charge or just someone with a lot of influence who doesn't think that it would be good politics to help, or who is actively evil and working against the heroes. Or maybe the cops all just get stranded in the sewers for 5 months. Okay, so not every scenario works, but you can see what they were going for. In theory, the idea was sound, even if the execution was flawed. Although, actually, the concept of Batman doesn't work if the cops aren't already corrupt, so if you're going to tell a story where the city is overrun by bad guys and you're going to remove the cops entirely rather than have the cops become part of the lawlessness, then maybe you've forgotten what makes Batman stories function. But that's hardly the only issue with The Dark Knight Rises. That movie is very strange. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, then like, subscribe, and ring the bell. If you want to see my videos early and ad-free and maybe get some other cool bonuses, support me on Patreon. Come and join my Discord server to hang out with other awesome people, and follow me on Twitch to catch my live streams. I also theoretically have a newsletter. You can sign up for that below. This video also has a lot to do with the role of your heroes in the world and how many other powerful NPCs there might be. So for more on this subject, check out my video about how adventurers are perceived. Until next time, play fair and have fun.